This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State law professor Roger McEowen and K-State agriculture policy specialist Jenny Ifft began today's show by discussing Commodity Credit Corporation loans and how they relate to the Farm Bill. The show continues with Jeff Whitworth, a crop entomologist at K-State, as he talks about ragworms and headworms and what they mean for producers. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk completes the show by talking about a recently released report by the Milk Market Administrator's Office in Kansas City that details how Kansas dairy farmers fared nationally in 2022 and some of the emerging trends in the dairy industry. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're starting our Tuesday show, how we normally do, with some more information about the Farm Bill. And today we're joined by K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist and Flinchball Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft, and K-State and Washburn Law Professor, Roger McEowen. Jenny, Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
And so, Roger, we brought you in today to talk a little bit about the Commodity Credit Corporation. And so could you give us a bit of history on it and why it's created?
Sure. It's a wholly owned United States government corporation. It was created way back during the Great Depression in 1933 with the purpose of stabilizing and supporting and protecting farm income and prices. So that's its basic charter as to what the purpose, the congressional purpose behind it is. It's federally chartered by the CCC Charter Act of 1948. It was originally just created by executive order in 1933 by President Roosevelt. And then 6 years later, it was transferred to the USDA by, again, another executive order. But it was incorporated in 1948, again, with the purpose of preventing in agriculture another depression in terms of farm prices. So its basic function, again, is to stabilize and support and protect farm income and prices. And it's also now the federal government's primary financing arm for many domestic as well as international ag programs. So it's basically there to maintain balance and adequate supplies of ag commodities and aid in the distribution of those commodities.
Jenny, how does this tie into the Farm Bill?
Well, the CCC will fund a lot of the Farm Bill programs. My understanding is that a lot of that funding is authorized by the Farm Bill, but then Congress has to reimburse the CCC funding. So I think a lot of times that is routine, but there is always potential for some trouble when you have to send something back to Congress. The other part of that is that the CCC can be used on an ad hoc basis by the Secretary of Agriculture. They've had varying degrees of authority to do that in the past. So if something isn't explicitly authorized in the Farm Bill, there's a potential for the CCC to fund that, say, for example, when there's some type of disaster that happens.
Besides disaster, what are some other programs that the CCC funds?
Some of the NRCS programs are funded by the CCC, export control, for example.
A lot of the conservation programs are supported by CCC funds and commodity operations, of course, and various food aid programs. And as Jenny indicated, foreign market development and export credit also is funded by CCC. It's very broad in terms of the funding, but again, operating under the general premise that the CCC funds can be utilized in any fashion to stabilize, support, and protect farm income and prices. That can involve the conservation funding. That can involve food aid. That can involve foreign market development and export credit. So it's really broad under that general rubric of supporting the stabilization of farm commodity prices.
And Roger, the CCC loans funds to farmers. So really, how does that all work?
The Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC, in terms of loaning funds to farmers, has been a widely used tool in the past. Now, with the way agricultural markets function, it hasn't been used as heavily in recent years. But that's always a cyclical thing, and it will be used to make loans to farmers. And it does make these commodity and farm storage facility loans where farmers' crops, then, to get a loan, they pledge their crops as collateral. And those loans are part of the overall price and income support system of the federal farm programs. Again, under that general heading, keep in mind the charter here, the CCC funds are to be used to support and stabilize commodity prices. So that's what these loans do. So a farmer takes out a loan and then they repay the loan. That's called a redemption of the loan. The farmer can sell the grain, feed it to livestock, or store it. And this is where the concept of sealing grain comes in. A lot of farmers are familiar with that and others are familiar with that. But most of them are non-recourse. And what that means is when the time comes for the loan to mature, if the loan plus interest isn't paid, then all the farmer does is simply forfeit the commodity back to the CCC, and that's deemed to be full payment for the loan. What that does is effectively establish a minimum price, because the farmer can always just forfeit the grain if prices drop below the loan value, and they still get the ability to market their grain if commodity prices go up. So it establishes a floor. That's the stabilization impact of a CCC loan.
You mentioned the CCC funds, and has there been some controversy around that?
Periodically, there is controversy over the use of funds, and of course, when budgets are tight in Washington, D.C., this issue comes up. But Secretary Vilsack has really pushed the button on this and has yanked the chain of some of the committees in Congress in trying to use CCC funds to fund an initiative known as Partnerships for Climate-Smart Commodities. So what they're trying to do there is use CCC funds for the development of markets for commodities with a lower carbon footprint. Well, that has raised the ire of a number in Congress saying, now, wait a minute, farm bills and farm policy shouldn't be run by special interest groups that are hung up on climate change and climate policy. And they view that as outside the charter of the CCC in terms of using funds to stabilize farm commodity prices. So the Secretary thinks he found a loophole here. This may end up ultimately in Congress addressing that by passing specific legislation to close the supposed loophole. Frankly, personally, I don't think it's a loophole. I think this is an impermissible use of CCC funds, but my opinion doesn't count on this. We'll see what Congress does. But yeah, that is a controversial point right now.
And that's one controversial point, but there's actually another one, and it involves a new proposed act.
Yeah, this has been Senator Grassley's kind of trademark for decades on payment limitations. And this is known as the Farm Program Integrity Act of 2023. And what it would do is put a hard cap of $250,000 on payments per year in your total commodity support for any one farm operation. Now, it's got some weird language in it on this point because it requires payment recipients spend at least 1,000 hours involved in farm labor or management. So 50% of your time, we think of a 2,000-hour work year, so half time, and it's and, not or, and 50% of the total time required to conduct the farming operation, whatever that means. And I'm not certain yet what the drafters are meaning by that. The bill does allow family and extended family members to qualify as actively engaged without each member being required to meet their own individual service hour requirements. And crop share landlords are considered to be active, but cash rent landlords, of course, are not. They're not viewed as being engaged in a farming operation. So that's the way it is now. That doesn't change. But what Senator Grassley is pointing to, and also Sherrod Brown, Senator of Ohio, they're looking at data that currently shows that only 10% of farms receive 70% of farm program payment subsidies. So their intentions are to bring back USDA enforcement and ensure the targeting of farm commodity payments to family farms. And I think the issue here is that that's well-intentioned, and that's always been kind of the purpose of Senator Grassley's efforts over the years. In practicality, the way that works out might be kind of difficult. The labor requirement, as I indicated a moment ago, that is oddly worded with that 1,000 hours and 50% requirement. And in addition, I think it'll merely drive large farms to create two-person partnerships instead of six-person entities. And we can do that from a legal standpoint pretty easily. When we get rules like this, we as lawyers look at this and we can restructure the farming operation to game, so to speak, the farm program payment limitation system. So that'll add to complexity and administrative hassle. So that's got a long way to work those things out. And Senator Grassley knows, particularly there are folks like me out there that know how to counsel farmers to get around those rules legally. So it's got a long way to go.
Jenny, focusing back towards you with current issues around the nutrition funding.
Right. So I think, understanding what happens with the Farm Bill or agricultural policy in general, especially the safety net, you have to have a basic understanding of the CCC. You also have to have understanding of what's frequently referred to as a baseline or more broadly, congressional budgeting rules. So right now, as the Farm Bill is developing, the Congressional Budget Office is developing a baseline or a 10-year projection of spending under the vast and different areas of the Farm Bill. And right now, nutrition has they're updating it, but last time it was about 84% of the baseline. So 84% is for nutrition programs. The bulk of the other funds go for the farm safety net, for conservation, for crop insurance, things we've talked about before. And so the whole pie has grown since the last Farm Bill, but the pie has grown more for nutrition programs. So that is coming up in Farm Bill debates. It also affects how different groups negotiate or lobby for the Farm Bill, that, you have different programs have a different share of the budget. That's their share. So it's not necessarily an argument about let's create an optimal policy for scratch. Let's do as good as we can within this existing framework of the baseline, where you get a different budget for different aspects of the Farm Bill.
Yeah, I would just add that my personal view here is it's unfortunate that we have to wrap in nutrition spending in a Farm Bill because, as Jenny indicated correctly, it's 85-86% of total spending under the Farm Bill doesn't go to farmers. It goes to food aid, so to speak. And that's unfortunate. In an ideal world, those would be pulled apart. But I think in the political world, the realization is that you don't get a Farm Bill done because you're not going to get the urban senators and representative support if you don't have the nutrition spending in there. So that's just the political reality of it. I think that a lot of people in the public may not understand that when they hear the term Farm Bill, that farmers don't get the lion's share. They don't even get the majority share. They get a vast minority of the actual spending that's authorized by the Farm Bill.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen and K-State agriculture policy specialist and Flinchbaugh agriculture policy chair Jenny Ifft. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show now with some information about some sorghum insects. And then to share some of his knowledge with us, we have K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, good morning. My pleasure. Anytime.
Sorghum insects, first talking about ragworms. And so why are we talking about it?
Because a lot of folks around the state seem to be concerned about ragworms, and that's kind of the case every year. In sorghum, it's actually the same species, armyworm, corn earworm, fall armyworm. One of those, or a combination of all three, that get into corn and or sorghum, but right now the corn's pretty much past the stage where you need to worry about the worms. But right now it's sorghum. A lot of sorghum around the state is just coming into the whorl stage. And right now there's considerable concern because of the whorl stage feeding that these worms are doing. Most of the ones I've seen so far this year are corn earworms. Doesn't really matter. They do the same kind of damage. But from an academic standpoint, it makes a little difference. So most of them are feeding right now. They're down in the whorl. And as the plant grows up, those leaves grow out of that whorl stage. They unfurl, and they have these big ragged-looking leaves, or they look like they've been shredded in some cases, because those worms, as they are down inside that whorl, they are taking a bite out of that rolled-up leaf, and as that leaf unfurls, and the bite becomes 4 or 5 bites and becomes pretty noticeable. Corn earworms are pretty much aggressive, so if it is a corn earworm, there'll probably only be one in the whorl. If it's an armyworm or a fall armyworm, there might be 2 or 3. But as far as the ragged leaves is concerned, it doesn't really matter as far as the damage go. That's why I say it's pretty much academic at this point. As those leaves grow out, then the growers get concerned because they think that all that damage is going to impact yield. In the last 20 years, we've done 4 or 5 different pretty comprehensive yield studies on ragworm damage, and we have not been able to show any reduction in yield due to the ragworm. That means those plants are really, really resilient at compensating for that leaf feeding damage that we see at this point in time. So we really do not recommend treating for ragworms for two different reasons. Number one, what I just said was because that leaf feeding does not cause any yield reduction. But the second reason is by the time most of the growers notice it, when those leaves have grown out and they actually see the damage, those worms are through feeding and they have crawled out of the whirl and they're down in the soil pupating. So if you spray it, you're not going to get the insecticide down to where they are anyway, and they've done all the damage. So we really do not recommend treating for whorl stage or ragworms in sorghum and or corn. Right now we're talking about sorghum, like I said, just because of the developmental stage it's in right now. But from all the research we've done over the years, the ragged-looking leaves, the shredding of the leaves during the whorl stage do not negatively impact yield. So please resist the temptation from treating during the whorl stage.
Is there concern then when the next generation comes?
Yes. As I said, most of these worms then are down in the soil pupating. So they'll pupate for 3 or 4 days. Then they'll become an adult. They'll lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch. And what they're looking for the most part, is succulent leaf or any kind of plant tissue for those young larvae to feed on. So a lot of times after the ragworms come out and they pupate and they become adults, the sorghum is about at the heading stage. So at the flowering stage, the early production of the berries, they're really attractive to these worms that were earlier in the whorl. That they fly around and they'll lay their eggs on the berries or the kernels or on the heads, whatever you want to call them. The nice thing about that is the heads are only vulnerable from flowering until soft dough. Once that sorghum gets to the soft dough stage, they're not as attractive to the moths for egg laying because the berries are just too hard for those larvae to feed on. But we've also been able to quantify the amount of damage due to worms in the head, and we've done this 2 or 3 different times over the last 40 years, and it's consistent. You lose 5% per worm per head. So you got 1 worm per head, you're losing 5%, 2, 10, 3, 15, etc. It's really easy to calculate, and in my opinion, it's one of the easier crops to actually go around and sample to determine the treatment threshold. As those heads are flowering, I just get a 1-gallon white bucket, go around and bend the head over and shake it vigorously against the sides of the bucket. Do that for 10 plants. Look in there and see how many larvae you have. So then you do that in several different parts of the field. Tells you just really close what the treatment threshold is if you don't treat or if you do treat. The nice thing about that is those heads are up there. They're pretty well exposed. So if you do decide to treat, if you do need an insecticide application, they're right up there where the insecticide gets to them. Remember, the insecticides we use are contact insecticides. Generally, you get pretty good efficacy if you decide to treat, but what you want to remember is you want to treat early on. You want to catch these larvae while they're small, and they're only going to feed for about 2 weeks. Once that 2-week period is gone by, there can still be a few worms, but they're not going to cause much damage. Most of the damage will be from flowering to soft dough, and if you get out and you look and your heads already have that what they call blasted appearance, where there's no berry or no kernel in the bracts, it's probably too late to treat. Most of the damage has been done. Again, those insects crawl down the plant, they pupate in the soil, and then those, generally corn earworm adults or armyworm adults will fly off to soybeans or some other plant that is a little more succulent that offers a little more attractiveness for their egg laying. So the ragworms, same thing as the headworms. It's just they don't cause a problem. Once they get to be the headworms, 5% loss per head per yield. But as long as you get proper coverage, because these are contact insecticides, you can get pretty good efficacy with the treatment.
One thing when thinking about treating, though, is taking into consideration sugarcane aphids.
Yes, ever since 2014, we've had sugarcane aphids migrate into the state, and that has caused some confusion about whether to treat if you may have a sugarcane aphid infestation or not. They're already migrating into Kansas this year. I've heard of a couple of spots down around the south central part of the state where they've already treated for sugarcane aphids. So that's one of the problems is if you do have the worms feeding on the head, you know exactly what you're losing. If you do not have sugarcane aphids yet, you don't know if you're going to have the population to justify treating for sugarcane aphids. In the last, since 2017 or 18, we have not had populations. Every year we get them migrating in, but we have not had populations on a large-scale basis to justify treating. Occasionally here or there are, in my opinion, the majority of the reason for that is because of the beneficials that are in these fields. Lady beetles, green lacewings, other parasitoids, there are a lot of insects that actually use the sugarcane aphid as a food source. If you spray for headworms, you're going to kill the beneficials. Those insecticides, same ones you use for headworms, will kill the aphids. But the problem with that is a lot of the aphid colonies will be on the underside of a leaf, or those aphids continue to migrate in and reproduce parthenogenically. So you're going to kill the headworms, and if you spray a general insecticide, it will kill the aphids, but they will build up quicker because a lot of the populations are on the underside of the leaf where the insecticide doesn't get to them, or as those beneficials are decimated, those populations will start building back up as soon as the insecticide is degraded enough so it's not effective. So then we can have problems with sugarcane aphids. There are some products on the market that are virus products that are supposed to be more specific to headworms, fall armyworms and army cutworms. There's some problems associated with those. We have not tested those at K-State yet. Some guys are telling me they've tried those. They work pretty well. They don't kill the beneficials. They just kill the worms in the head. So that's something to consider. There are also some products out there that are pretty specific for aphids, and they work really well for just killing the aphids, and they help preserve some of the beneficials. So those are some of the considerations if you're growing sorghum, if it's just now going from the whorl stage, getting ready to go into the heading stage, to get out and sample or monitor for headworms and for sugarcane aphids from now until the sugarcane aphids can still be out there until October. The headworms are only going to be actually affecting the heads from flowering till soft dough.
And something we've talked about a few times on the show is chinch bugs. However, you wanted to give us a quick update.
Chinch bugs. I've heard most about chinch bugs in the last 3 months, I would guess, on corn earlier and now sorghum. Chinch bugs are really bad. They're not going away. They're going to be here from now, and they're going to overwinter. They're native to Kansas. The nice thing about it, we have had some rains around that have gotten the sorghum to grow a little bit, and so therefore they're a little better able to tolerate chinch bug feeding. The chinch bugs, they are spreading out. They're laying eggs, and we still have another generation to come where you're going to have a lot more nymphs. Those nymphs are behind the leaf sheath. If you do decide you needed to treat, you need to make sure you get that insecticide down around the base of the plant. But one of the caveats to that also is as those plants start putting on berries, when those berries are soft and filling, chinch bugs will move up to the head also. We've put out some trials with treating chinch bugs when they're actually affecting the head or the marketable product that work pretty well also. So you need to get out and watch for sugarcane aphids, or some people just call them sorghum aphids now, and or chinch bugs and headworms for the next month or two while the sorghum's still actively growing.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. I will link K-State's Crop Insects in Kansas Handbook in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. The Milk Market Administrator's Office in Kansas City tracks the milk produced in the U.S. and recently released data from 2022. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk looks at how Kansas dairy farmers fared in the report and some of the emerging trends reflected in the report.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some changes we've seen in 2022 when it comes to where milk is produced here in the United States. The Milk Marketing Administrator's Office in Kansas City does a nice job of doing a summary every December, looking at the total milk that's shipped across all marketing areas in the U.S. Now, this doesn't include quite all of the milk produced in the U.S. In 2022, it accounted for about 91% of the total volume. There are a few areas across the United States that are not covered by the federal milk marketing orders. Recently, they published some data that broke this information down by county across the United States. So in the United States, we have about 3,142 counties, And of those counties, about 467 counties actually saw increased marketings during 2022 when looking at the December data. So where did we see most of those increased milk marketings? Well, actually it was in the western part of the United States. I know many of you have heard that, California is having some issues with production and shrinking cow numbers. However, if you look at the December numbers from 2022, there was actually many counties in California that saw an increase in milk production. Now let's be a little more specific here in Kansas. I know most of you are aware that we do have some expansion of our dairy herd in the western part of the state. So we had several counties in the western part of the state that saw increased marketings during 2022. However, what might surprise you is that we also had counties on the eastern side of the state that had an increase in milk marketings. Even Riley County, where Kansas State University is located, saw an increase in milk marketings in December of 2022. There are also a few counties north of us that saw increased marketings, as well as down in the south central part of the state. So for Kansas, we are continuing to see some increase in milk production, not only in the western part of the state, but also here on the eastern side as well. Now, as you look across the United States, there were a huge number of counties that saw decreased marketings in 2022. Actually, about 1,174 counties saw decreased marketings during 2022, according to the data published by the Milk Market Administrator's Office. Now, I thought it was kind of interesting as you look at the marketings of each county. 13 counties in the United States accounted for 25% of all of the milk marketed in December 2022. That's about 0.41% of the total counties in the United States. In fact, if you look at 75% of the milk produced in December of 2022 or sold under the federal milk marketing orders, only 159 counties accounted for that milk, about 5.6% of total counties in the United States. And we actually have 4 counties from within Kansas that fall into that category as well. As you look at the total number of counties producing milk in December of 2022 across the United States, only about 43 total counties in the U.S. actually marketed milk in December of 2022. So as we look at our dairy industry, yes, there is increased consolidation, and yes, we are very intensive in the areas where we produce milk across the United States. Many counties across the United States do produce milk. However, we see that number continuing to decrease and a higher percentage of it in more concentrated areas. I do not think this will change as we move through the next 10 to 20 years as we see infrastructure issues in some of these areas that are seeing decreases in milk production. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a look at the data and see where milk is being produced in the United States.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Whitworth. This is the K-State Radio Network.